were doing everything they could to save him couldn't get him out. And, you know, and you think, oh, God, no, what a disaster. And then you think, hang on, the police have told you that. That's not true. For God's sake, Stack, pull yourself together. That won't be what happened. But even I didn't quite expect to be proved so right so quickly and by so much evidence that they had beaten him. They initially tried to say it was a heart attack. It wasn't a heart attack. That they hadn't hit him, they had hit him. And they'd hit lots of other people in the process. And then one of the, I saw the family talking about the responses they got. The one that amused me the most, if you can be amused in these circumstances, because there's nothing amusing about the death of Ian Tomlinson, but it was that they actually seriously turned round and said that the person who hit him might have been a member of the public dressed in a police uniform. This well-known tactic. No doubt the person who hit Nicola Fisher was another member of the... Well, I'll tell you what, I'll own up now. We in the SWP, we had a meeting, we said, let's go out, buy a job lot of police uniform, and then beat up our own people. That'll teach you. And the family were also angered by the select committee, the parliamentary select committee report. Because again, I don't know if anybody read it, it talks about Ian collapsing. It doesn't talk about him being belted. He didn't collapse because he passed out with the heat, or because he passed out with his heart, or because he tripped over something. He went to the ground because somebody hit him. That's not collapsing. I tell you now, if I thump you in the face and you go down, when I get into court they don't charge me with collapsing you. That's not what they do. And they also talk about the problem was possibly inexperienced officers. Now, apart from the fact that this bloody force is meant to be a specialist force, specially trained, it did take me back. It did take me back to the days of the good old life on Mars, when every now and again, when they absolutely could no longer deny that something shocking had happened, they would say, there's just one or two rotten apples. It appears now the problem isn't that they're rotten, it's that they're not yet ripe. We have these apples that are not yet ripe, and if only they were, they'd be perfectly safe to eat. But they're not, and therefore they're killing us. And you know, this nonsense that is taught. And what all these things shows you is an absolute need for vigilance, an absolute need to challenge the notion of the new life on earth police. This new different force. I think it's so important that the united campaign against police violence of trade unionists and socialists and activists and family members has been set up. These people need to be held to account. Every time something like this happens, it needs to be broadcast throughout the country. Every time there needs to be a protest. Every time they need to be taken to issue. They should not be allowed to get away with one minor infringement without somebody being able to get up and say, you who tell us you're so different, you're at it again. You're doing it again, and therefore that's important. So, why do they behave like this? You know, they're now educated. They're now sophisticated. They're not, they're not these sort of, they're not Anderton. To be honest, not only would Ian Blair not say that, I don't think he'd believe it. I mean, they're not the same, and yet they're not different. Ultimately, they're not different. Is it individuals? I mean, I have something of a stake in this, to be honest, I'll own up. Here's an audience, time to get these things out of the way. My father was a cop, you know. My father was, he's dead now, so there's not much point hissing him, but he was a cop. To my knowledge, the man never did a corrupt thing in his life. He was honest. I enjoyed his company. In my later years, in my teenage years, I fought him like a tiger. But nevertheless, you know, was it him? I go to Spurs every fortnight. There are a couple of cops there who drive off the traffic wardens who don't want to let me park where I want to. Nice of them. They're not unreasonable people. That's not the point. It's not about whether the individual is not. I want to come back to my father, incidentally, because I want to show that whether he was nice or not didn't prevent him being drawn into a collective body that responded to things in a certain way. But I'll do that a little bit later, sort of slightly guiltily, because he's not here to defend himself. But there we go. But the truth is, it's not whether they're educated or not and they're nice or not. The fact of the matter is that as long as you live in a society in which the minority of that society, who control and own wealth, also control and own state apparatus, they need to maintain that control precisely because they're a minority through two things: fraud and force. The fraud is we've all got an equal vote. The fraud is we've always all got an equal chance. You know, every time you see that utterly repugnant bastard Alan Sugar on the telly with The Apprentice, if you deem to watch it, you really shouldn't own up in this meeting. But if you do, you know, he seems to be, I'm a self-made man, I came from nothing, we can all do it. That sort of, of course one or two people can do it, but that sort of notion, that fraud, that we all have a stake and that this is the only way things can be, is backed up by a series of forces so that when we stop believing this is the only way things can be, or at least stop believing it about one little piece of our lives, our job, our factory, a war somewhere in the world or whatever, that there are forces there capable of dealing with our protest. And that's what they're there for. Of course that's not how they sell themselves. They don't come to us and say, we're here to protect the minority's wealth against you lot. No, we're here to solve crime, which is a huge joke and would be the subject of a meeting all in and of itself. Anybody who's ever been burgled, who has had to deal with the police, let me tell you, they're insurance brokers. That's the only job they play in that process. That they're there to protect us, that they're there to prevent chaos and so on. In reality, they're there to protect the status quo. They are not neutral. They don't listen to both sides of an argument and decide whether, you know, you try it the next time you're on a picket line. Excuse me, officer, I think we've got a really good case here. These bosses lied to us. They asset stripped the factory. They're going to destroy all our lives. Would you mind if, while we picket, you just beat them over the heads with truncheons if they try to go in? Try it. I mean, try putting any case to them. In every major conflict that has faced our class throughout the history of policing, they have been on the other side, regardless of how valid our case is. From the general strike in 1926, we had a very valid case. Vietnam, everybody agrees it was an absolutely shitty war, yet they beat the protesters off the streets with truncheons. Lewisham and Southall, we were protesting against the National Front marching in black and Asian areas. What could be better than that? They beat us off the streets, or attempted to, and murdered Blair Peach in the process. Grunwicks, for God's sake, poorly paid Asian women workers being exploited by a sweatshop owner. Who did they side with? The sweatshop owner, and beat us off the streets. The miners' strike, when it was absolutely obvious that Thatcher was destroying the lives of whole communities, they beat us off the streets. The poll tax. Nobody believed the poll tax was fair apart from Thatcher and one or two of her more go-ho ministers. The police beat us off the streets, or tried to. And now G20. The truth is, what happens to the police is they're separated off from the rest of society. Whatever their original backgrounds, they're pulled away. They're given uniforms. They're paid better than everybody else. They're paid that so much more than other public sector workers to keep them out of the frame. Indeed, there was a police strike way back in 1918. There was a police strike, and so scared were they of it that they made sure that police would never identify themselves as workers and as trade unionists, and sought to do that. They made sure that they don't live in the communities that we live in, that working people live in, that ethnic minorities live in, that the poor live in. That's not where they live. That in this process they create a collective identity of prejudice, a collective identity of bias, whatever they may say. All the police training colleges, again and again, you get the racism, the sexism and so on. You know, going back to my poor old dad, I remember him. He was utterly fair, but he did think that certain people were really bad before they'd done anything. Long-haired people like me, at the time, corner boys as he used to call them. There were also the goods and the bads of society. When I went home recently, I was talking to my brother and sister about this, and we remembered a story which we'd sort of forgotten, but which sums up, and if my dad was alive, I know he'd feel awful about this, but nevertheless it tells you. When he was a cop, way back when he was, let's say, in the 60s, two young boys escaped from a Christian Brothers orphanage and came to the police station and complained that they'd been badly beaten by the Christian Brothers. My father and his sergeant went and talked to the Christian Brothers, who told them that these two kids were delinquents. They handed the kids back to the Christian Brothers. That's a terrible thing to say, but that would have been the absolutely accepted notion. Who tells the truth? Christian Brothers, respectable members of society, and who tells lies, illegitimate